The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
Hi there, and welcome to the Cipher Brief Studio. I'm Suzanne Kelly here, as usual, with Brad Christian. Looking forward to welcoming Mandiant CEO Kevin Mandia to the studio in just a couple of minutes. First, I have just a couple of quick announcements for you. I want to share two great opportunities with you from the Cipher Brief. The first is an invitation to sign up for the Cyber Initiatives Group, both the summit and the newsletter. You can find details at cyberinitiativesgroup.com, and our guest today actually is a principal member of this group, and 4 times a year we hold open sessions on cyber threats to kind of share a wide range of perspectives on these issues and how they impact you, whether you're an individual or a business. We really focus on educational components and sharing best practices and hearing from a wide range of people. So I encourage you to check it out. The next summit is May 25th. I will be co-hosting that along with former Deputy Director of the NSA, Rick Leggett. The engagement at these sessions is truly off the charts, so I encourage you to save your seat right now. There are also links to register in the Cipher Brief's free daily newsletter, which I hope you already receive every day. It is free after all and loaded with great information. You can sign up for that at thecipherbrief.com. The second opportunity I want to share with you is if you're not a Cipher Brief Subscriber Plus member yet, you're not getting the full access to our network of experts. So I want to make sure you know about Subscriber Plus privileges, like access to today's excellent piece on NATO's emergency session tomorrow in Brussels. We talked to 2 former Supreme Allied Commanders of NATO because we wanted to know what they're going to be looking at. The rhetoric is upticking. We're talking now about chemical, biological weapons, what the red lines are going to be, NATO's response. It's great to get insights directly when you need them from folks like Admiral Jim Stavridis and General Phil Breedlove. So if you're not a Subscriber Plus member, you can upgrade your access today at thecipherbrief.com. Okay, let's get down to business. The White House is warning U.S. businesses this week about potential Russian cyber attacks. President Biden has warned that Moscow is likely to use cyber attacks and said Putin really has his back up against the wall. But even last month, the FBI, CISA, the NSA were warning that US cleared defense contractors were at risk of Russian cyber attacks as well. It's pretty obvious that in the big picture, we're now living in a constant state of competition in the cyber domain, an age where there are no more secrets, and now we're in the middle of a war in Ukraine. Let's get to some logistics before I welcome Kevin very quickly. I'd like to welcome my media colleagues to today's call as well. It's always great to have you with us. Today's conversation is on the record. We have a number of Cipher Brief experts and former directors of intelligence agencies on the call today. It's always a pleasure to welcome you and thank you for your time. I'd also like to thank Mandiant for sponsoring today's session as well. And if you're interested in following Mandiant's lead and sharing information on a broad basis when it comes to threats like this, please contact Erica Hipkins. You can find her at ehipkins@thecipherbrief.com. Now, for anyone who'd like to ask a question, please do so using the chat box. It's probably on the right-hand side of your screen if you have a setup like mine. If you're joining us on your phone, you can always email Brad your questions at bchristian@thecipherbrief.com. I anticipate a ton of questions today. We have a huge number of people who have signed up for this, so don't wait to send those questions in. Go ahead and get them going. We'll tee them up. If there are redundant questions, we do kind of combine those so we're not wasting Kevin's time today, but we are getting to the answers. So don't be offended if we don't use it, but get those in early. All right, I am so pleased to welcome Kevin Mandia to the Cipher Brief studio. Kevin is the Chief Executive Officer of Mandiant, and he previously served as CEO of FireEye. He was the CEO, of course, when the company discovered and then publicly disclosed the SolarWinds hack. Kevin has spent more than 20 years in information security and is a former Air Force officer. And today he also serves as a principal member of the Cyber Initiatives Group. Kevin, welcome.
Suzanne, thanks for having me. Hopefully I'm coming in loud and clear.
You are, you look great, and we really appreciate you joining us today. Today's session really, Kevin, was meant to focus on Ukraine and how private sector intelligence is now defining a new world, because I think what we saw in the opening days of this war in Ukraine was really revolutionary. But before we talk about that, and I want to talk about these new warnings from President Biden.
Sure.
I think you joined us last year and said the Russians are great at cyber attacks. You obviously, disclosed the SolarWinds hack in your time at FireEye. It's difficult, Kevin, to understand if you're a business or even an individual what these new warnings mean. How would you kind of frame up where we are right now in terms of risk to business?
Yeah, it's Suzanne, it's a great question. When I saw the Biden's alert, obviously there's something behind it. So that means probably in the classified environment, you're going to get a lot more details, but signals are there, whether that means there's staging of attacks or, somebody seeing something and escalating the news. But on the outside, all you get is, hey, be vigilant. And, every day waking up going, hey, we got to be vigilant. You got to turn that into action. And that's why a lot of companies like mine, you have to say, how do you prepare for a Russian cyber attack? Is it about destruction? Is it about denial of service? Is it about, I doubt in today's day and age, and based on what we've got, it's going to be a low and slow kind of breach. So there are steps you can take, and many companies have published, as well as CISA has a whole site. They're calling it Shields Up. I love the operational name, Shields Up. Do it. Just, if I'm a CISO right now, I'm telling the leaders of my organizations, hey, listen, we've got to do 24/7 monitoring. If we don't have two-factor authentication everywhere, we've got to do that. We've got to look at our attack surface from the outside and make sure we decrease our exposure there. We got to make sure our patching's unprecedented vigilance in any perceived vulnerabilities. And by the way, just keep going down the list. I could probably go for 20 minutes on what to do. But my gut, and I'm not a FUD guy, we just go where the attacks are and we respond. I think the whole world's wondering, based on the conflict in Ukraine, with economic sanctions, with actual kinetics, what triggers the cyber attacks that go beyond the region? And we don't know. I don't think anybody has a bright line on, hey, if the pain gets to this much, then cyber is a viable alternative for the Russian government to start exercising. So I think we're all, waiting for it. But the good news, Suzanne, is the minute it hits, we'll all know it. We're all going to, the first shot across the bow when the cyber domain starts to escalate outside of the Ukrainian theater, I think we're all going to be pretty well aware of it at that moment.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. And to your point, it has been very difficult to understand triggers and what's escalating this conflict. I mean, we've seen activities from the Russian government that simply are unexplainable, particularly when it comes to how they're sort of using some of their equipment. But Kevin, you've been doing this for 20 years now. You know very well what the Russians are capable of, the industries that they target. Are there specific industries where, and we can only say now based on the past, they have targeted with more focus than they do others?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny, I was doing the math. I've actually been doing it for 28 years, but I'm conservative. Like a financial officer, I round down and I don't round up like a sales guy. The reality is Russia's got different groups that do different things. So when you think about what's on the table, what can they bring to bear against the United States or the European allies? Well, it depends on whether you're up against the GRU, the FSB, just a Russian citizen who wants to wreak havoc to promote their country's agenda, or the SVR. And I don't believe, Putin can wake up today and say, hey, listen, I want to hack the New York Stock Exchange. I think that would have been a decision made a while ago. And those steps in that operation would have been planned out a lot in advance. But I think what's on the table broadly is either just a swath of indiscriminate attacks just to cause mass damage, but at the same time frame, what's on the table is a precision strike attack that goes deep, maybe at a utility or something like that. So I don't think anybody really knows what tactic will be deployed, and it could be a blend of both. Hey, let's just go wide on offense, and if we can hack it, we do, and if we can destroy it, we do. That's the indiscriminate path. And then there's the precise. We've been in for a while. We've done our homework. We know how to bring down a utility, or we know how to take out a couple critical organizations or companies. I don't know what will take place. I think that some folks that advise me, and I get intel briefings at my company all the time, they've said it may be something that feels reciprocal to what's actually happening, economically. So it could be that our financial services are targeted because that feels like a reciprocal type of attack. And then the cyber domain's a good domain to exercise an attack because it's probably less threatening than kinetics, so certainly it's going to be seen as less escalation than a physical escalation. And then you've got to believe defense industrial base is always going to be a target, and oil maybe, because that would be inside, oil and gas could be inside of what would be considered reciprocation. If we damage their business in oil and gas with a bunch of economic sanctions, maybe they try to do the same to us via a cyber attack. So Suzanne, that's just all hypotheticals. I don't have the crystal ball on this one, but I do know when the gloves come off, if they come off, everyone in the United States is going to know about it very quickly because we're all on high alert, both the government organizations, the private sector. If we see anything, we're responding to more security breaches right now at Mandiant than we've ever responded to at one moment. And certainly if we see something, we'll escalate it. And I believe anybody else who sees something that's outside of standard operating, normal hum of cyber activity, it'll be escalated pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think we've seen a coming together of the industry that I want to talk about again in a minute that is also unprecedented. But before we do, I do want to ask you, the FBI director, Christopher Wray, has said that he's concerned that Russian cyber attacks may target U.S. infrastructure, critical infrastructure. And you noted a little bit of that by talking about finance. But so much of the critical infrastructure in this country is in private hands, Kevin. How prepared, based on what you've seen, and you don't have to name names, but how prepared are those private sector companies?
Well, the good news is we've never been more prepared. I mean, it's not like we're bad. Everybody's communicating, everybody's alert, everybody's involved. So I would call this community defense. And I thought, if you're going all out in cyber, if your intent is to cause mass damage when you go on offense, it would be to target critical infrastructure and specifically the utilities. If you don't have energy, you have no health care, you don't have finance. If you can take out energy, I just don't think that's A, the first thing people would try, and B, because by the way, that's just an enormous escalation. Attacking the financial services, I don't think you're going to get 100% hit rate on that. You're going to get some deleterious effect to some financial organizations, may not even be the bigs, it may be the small to mediums. But if you escalate to trying to shut down utilities, I feel like that's something that brings you to the brink of more kinetic activity. And it's also something that's hard to do. Every single major utility has fault tolerance, redundancy, test their cybersecurity. And it's one thing, Suzanne, to be able to break in cyber. It's a whole nother thing to take control of a utility and shut it down gracefully or ungracefully. And to do it ungracefully is really hard to do. So I'm not sitting back panicked about an attack on our grid, because I think that's over escalation based on what I can observe. It may not be successful, and it may be crossing a red line, because I'm pretty sure if you're an elected leader and a utility goes down somewhere, you got to do something about that.
My sense, though, Kevin, and I certainly don't have the expertise that you do, but we look at Colonial Pipeline and what happened there, and that one particular breach led to long lines of people waiting for gas, particularly in the southeast of the country. So I kind of wonder, it's a wild west in my mind out there, and things could happen accidentally that aren't even the original intention of any of those groups you named as hackers. I wonder when you think, it's kind of an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. We've come close to people being hurt by cyber attacks. There was the attack against a water facility in Florida. Why do you think that hasn't happened yet? And do you think we might possibly be at more risk of that now? And I'm not trying to scare. I just want to know.
I don't think we're at more risk. I think that the whole community has changed since Colonial Pipeline, both in the private sector and the public sector. Communication is better, information sharing is better, protocols are better. So why we haven't seen it is I'm convinced the attackers that compromised Colonial Pipeline didn't even know what Colonial Pipeline did. They didn't break into Colonial Pipeline from my vantage point with the purpose of shutting it down. They broke in with the purpose of making money. And so now if something happens, we have a conflict in the Ukraine. And with the conflict in Ukraine, I think every modern nation has to recognize they're going to be held somewhat accountable for what their citizens do at that moment. And I'm not sure the Russian government can exert a lot of influence and control over privateers and folks like that, but they have to recognize that those privateers can impact the doctrine of the United States if they're allowed to, with unfettered filtering, just attack us. We'll have to do something. So you have to think long and hard, in my opinion, if you're on offense, to intentionally cause grave damage. And I do not believe Colonial Pipeline was a long planned operation to do what it did. I actually do believe that was a ransomware actor trying to make money. So what's prevented it, Suzanne, is the risks and repercussions of a modern nation supporting a proactive destructive attack on critical infrastructure. That is a step that I've never really seen a government choose to do against the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen a lot of things I haven't seen before. So it will be interesting, particularly as we look at this meeting I mentioned off the top with NATO tomorrow, to kind of see how red lines evolve and then see how that leads into cyber. We have a great question here from Kelly Bissell. Kelly, congratulations on your move to Microsoft from our community. Kelly asks, is it true that every organization is a tech organization, even militaries? He says private sector is on the front lines now, which we're going to talk about. How do you see Google, Microsoft, and others become much more proactive and efficient with governments without getting dragged into politics? That's a very practical question.
Well, Kelly, that could be a 5-hour session, if not multi-week. I mean, when you look at, there's a lot of ways to address that question, but I look at when it comes to cyber defense, it starts with cyber threat intelligence. And we all can be pretty good at the strategic aspect of cyber intel. We're all pretty good at the tactical, but how the government collects, how the private sector collects is different. And what we get is different. The government's going to launch satellites to have imagery and intelligence gathered that way. We don't have a Mandian satellite out there getting imagery yet. So I just look at when it comes to the cyber domain, it is uniquely different than air, land, and sea and space in that it's got to be a shared intel collection. And because it's shared, we have to work together. And we have to find a way, especially for these huge platform companies like Google, Microsoft, Amazon, where you're servicing many different nations, you're global. We have to find a way to balance providing security with maintaining liberty and private, privacy for the citizens of different nations. But without a doubt, these big platform companies have an incredible potential for cyber threat intel collections. And I think all of them are trying to figure out, how do we do that? How do we leverage the intel we can generate with safeguarding the privacy of our customers? And that's something that's just got to be constantly evaluated. So, I mean, you think about Microsoft, they're 75% of the internet. They kind of know what's on your desktops, should they choose to know. And you think about Amazon and the amount of infrastructure that they have. These companies, they'll always have to do that balancing, Suzanne. But at the same time frame, I think we'll get better, and we are getting better, for all the private sector to figure out the rules of engagement where they can be a global organization. And when you're a global software company, that's one thing. When you're a global security company, that's another thing. Because with security, you tend to have to pick sides to some extent. You're going to protect from crime. We can all agree to do that. You can protect from unauthorized access. We all agree to do that. But then you protect from espionage, and who do you protect and when do you protect? We're all going to do that. But long story made short, all of us in the private sector are looking for ways to work with the governments of the world to make sure we can trust the internet as we go forward, and we can secure the cyber domain in a way that's predictable. Because right now, listen to our conversation, Suzanne, we're talking about, well, what's Russia going to do? Don't know. What's going to trigger them? Don't know. What could it be? Not sure. What should we do about it? 500-page book on what to do about it. And nobody can maintain a shields up posture every single day, all the time. So it'd be nice to know with the private sector leaning in and the government leaning in and us working together, that at some point in the future, we kind of know the boundaries and we know here's what will probably happen. We have rules of engagement that are rarely deviated from.
Yeah, and now we're seeing, and you mentioned this, and I know that this is always something that's on Kelly's mind too, is like how can some of these industry leaders from the private sector work together and collaborate in ways that do, serve the common good? And you mentioned that the industry kind of changed after Colonial Pipeline. Do you think the industry changed again with the launch of this war in Ukraine, when so many people who are leading tech companies, and Elon Musk comes to mind, and others, just started making a lot of their products for free? They started exposing what they were seeing. Where do you come down on doing things like that? And where are those lines for you?
It's, them when you see them, you try to draw it out, but the reality is there's a war going on right now. And with that, there's going to be a cyber component to it. And the challenge with the cyber domain is you do have unintentional consequences. Even if you're on offense and you're trying to, show a lot of restraint and do, and just target one nation, you may accidentally impact a lot of other nations, especially with a global economy where a lot of folks have employees in Ukraine or, in whatever theater emerges in a conflict zone. It is real hard to isolate your attacks in cyberspace. It just is. If you go after one machine, you have no idea what you might be impacting. And that's evident when you go back to the Colonial attack. When those ransomware actors spread ransomware, they had no idea what the results were going to be. When you go on offense and you do destructive attacks, you're not sure about the purpose of every machine that you may be destroying and what the downhill butterfly effects of those are. The bottom line, I think the line is essentially at some point you share all your threat intel to safeguard organization and keep them out of harm's way. You don't want to see a company go out of business because of a cyber attack. That's crazy to me, and it just shouldn't happen. We have to impose risks, repercussions, and rules. Nobody deserves to lose their job because a nation compromised their company and destroyed it. That just seems something we just can't allow to happen as a nation. So, it's hard to codify that, Suzanne, but you know it when you see it. If you see new TTPs being used by a threat actor that is targeting broadly, you have to help. You have to come forward with those things. If you see new TTPs used by an organization that's only going to target 3 to 5 companies, you may not have to tell the world just yet, but you sure as heck want to get to those 3 to 5 organizations. And I don't think anybody's got a bright line, but certainly it's a bright line if lives are at stake, and the intel can save lives. I think you got to share it. So we tend to be very inclusive with our intel. I think almost every company is. I was reading Microsoft Intel report this morning, comparing notes with their report and our report. I thought their report was great. It was free. I didn't have to go through 15 marketing gates to read it. And I think we got to do the same thing. And I think I recommend other security companies, we got to make this information available, period, and actionable.
Well, I usually don't advocate on these things. I usually just ask a lot of questions, but Kelly did follow up and say that he needs to work with you on this together. And I am going to also inject the Cyber Initiatives group into this, because the work that's done there, and you and Kelly are both principals in that group, is shared with everybody widely and for free. So I do think there are things that can be done there. And Kevin, I appreciate your leadership on that. I love the ideas. Let me get to a question now from Ken Dekleva. He says, Kevin, thanks for a great briefing. Given Russia's cyber capabilities, do you see them trying to take down social media in Ukraine, which has been critical in communication with the outside world, as well as in documentation of potential war crimes? It's a great question, Ken.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I'm a cyber expert, so you're going to get my layperson interpretation. I'm surprised cell phones still work in the Ukraine. I'm surprised there's still bandwidth. And some people say when Russia did the invasion, their intent was to leave all the comms up because they were going to use them when they were done. There's other theories that I just had that, hey, they want videos to come out. They want the communication to come out, that the Russian side may actually believe atrocities could be done by the Ukrainians, or they believe the thesis of their invasion would be supported by the Ukrainian folks. Whatever the reason, based on phones still working, comms still working, points of presence still working, I'm not so sure they're going to take down the social media sites. I think that I can tell you this though, on the other hand, I think all the social media platforms will always be targeted by the best hackers in the world, period.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just too
Mm-hmm.
much intel advantage for those platforms. And I can just give you a quick example. If there's a video posted to YouTube, the best intel on who posted that video, when they posted that video, what IP, what device was used, all that, it's at Google. There's the Facebook, same thing. These social media platforms are treasure troves for intelligence gathering. And I think modern nations want access to that. So I think that it's very credible to believe that the best hacking threats on the planet do at many times have access in some capacity to the social media companies.
Mm-hmm. Charles Faulkner says, we've seen the PSAs and the advisories. Owners and operators are hopefully now informed. But what is that kind of one more thing, he asked, that people can do at a small business or a household level in advance of an attack?
Household, it's real tough. I can tell you, for those that are influential, wealthy, look at your emails, protect from spear phishing, clear your emails on an iPad. Quite frankly, do more on an iPad maybe for now. When we talk to organizations, two-factor authentication is critical. Reducing your attack surface as small as possible. You have to know what is reachable via the internet and what to do about it. And we published a guide, and I'm trying to pop it open right now on the Mandiant website. And it was basically just exactly this: what to do, period, in regards to protecting your company. And it was endpoint. I can just tell you, figure out your external facing assets, reduce it as much as possible, make sure you're not vulnerable, run Tenable, Qualys, make sure you don't have internet facing vulnerabilities, make sure you patch it, make sure you have great lateral movement protections, password vaulting, change your passwords all the time, be able to actually, if you really think you're up against the best hackers in the world, the biggest bang for the buck is two-factor auth for everything, multi-factor auth when you're in the network, out of the network, doesn't matter where the hell you are. If you have to two-factor all the time, and the ability to remediate by changing all passphrases rapidly is a phenomenal impact, because my gut, for the best intrusions in the world, they've already happened. That's the reality. If there was a campaign to go on offense against the United States and to attack the financial services, the targeting for that, it started years ago, and the access is probably there. So you have to make sure that access is to one machine, one account, and that you can rapidly detect it and rapidly quash it. But for small businesses, have the smallest internet presence you can, go to multi-factor for everything you can. If you can leverage the cloud, Amazon, Microsoft, or Google, they've got security kind of built into those platforms, usually better than small to medium businesses. And then you want to do endpoint hardening. Make sure you have endpoint protection, period, turned on. Examples, CrowdStrike on the endpoint, Carbon Black on the endpoint. Microsoft Defender has a way to turn on cloud endpoint protections to detect anything new. Just research it. Tell your security folks, do these things. And we've got a proactive preparation and hardening PDF. It's, I don't know, I'm looking at it right now, 44 pages of bliss for your security staff to go and start doing those things. So that's what you can do.
I think every security team would love to read 44 pages of bliss. A great question here from Glenn Gerstel, who of course is a former general counsel from the NSA and one of our frequent guests at the threat conference down in Sea Island every year. Glenn, it's nice to see you. Thanks for your question. Kevin, given that attribution is time consuming and difficult, do you think there's a long-term technical solution for greater online identification that's realistic and still preserves benefits of anonymity where appropriate, or is it an all or nothing proposition?
That is a great question. It really is, because my gut, technical attribution in the cyber domain, when I say cyber, it's going to be really hard to get accurate technical attribution. The good news is during conflict, two things happen that help us get attribution faster. And you almost have to change your attribution protocols during conflict, in my opinion. But one, the volume of cyber activity is going to go up. So you're going to see more repeated patterns. And two, I think OPSEC has to go down. You're hoping for bad OPSEC though. In theory, if you run an offensive campaign in the cyber domain the way it works today, you can avoid attribution, definitive attribution, just based on the technical structure of it. And you're gonna have to rely more on SIGINT, human, and other collection capabilities to help you get there. But I think during this conflict that we're in right now, I think we're gonna have to have a little broader definition of attribution and really just consider any acts against our nation that are coming from the outside as hostile and motivated by the conflict. Bottom line, attribution, in my opinion, has gotten harder to some extent in cyber. When you're up against like the SVR, I think they can choose to be anonymous when they want to be anonymous. And you just got to hope their operational tempo and collection requirements pushes their OPSEC to the brink of making mistakes. I do hope that all intelligence, all intel collectively brings you the attribution you need to do a proportionate response. And I do believe during this conflict, we're going to have it. I can tell you that I'm not seeing in the things we are responding to in the Ukraine, we're not seeing the TTP lift or change. We're seeing the same things we've seen from groups out of Russia in the past. Let's hope it stays that way.
Emil Knockley here has a question. Of course, Emil retired as a senior officer from the CIA years ago. He said, could you please comment on 3 specific points? The degree of private intelligence, government intelligence collaboration, 1 or 2 wildcards that could hinder our response to a potential cyber attack, and I'll repeat these for you too if you want. And third, the redundancy of the power grids. For example, the Western power grid for those of us who live in the Southwest, and he's out in New Mexico.
Yeah. So, you know, common private versus public gets better every year. I've been doing this since 1993. You know, when I was in the US government in the Air Force responding to breaches, I don't remember ever telling a company, hey, you've been breached, even when it was in plain sight to the breaches I saw. But that was in the mid 90s. I mean, heck, we didn't even have e-commerce yet to some extent. It's changed quite a bit. You know, I was on a call with the government yesterday. It's how we began our day. There's open channels. Anything that we see new at Mandiant, if we see a new and novel attack, at least the TTPs for that new and novel, they're going to be in the government's hands really fast, you know, same day type of thing. Right now, I can't imagine there's even an hour delay if we see it. So that doesn't mean we're giving away customer information and privacy of individuals, but new and novel cyber attacks in today's environment need to be escalated quickly. And a lot of times it goes laterally, not just to the government, but to other companies, even companies we compete with. So bottom line, new and novel escalates fast. And that almost goes into the wild cards. Right now, we're not seeing anything new in regards to the new and novel. And that's where it'll hit us. Like to me, the worst case scenario we could have in the cyber domain right now, if tensions escalate, something triggers the gloves coming off against the United States in the cyber domain, is something like the SolarWinds breach. It's a supply chain compromise in the software we all rely on and depend on, and suddenly that software is going to have a nefarious and malicious purpose and just wipe stuff. Indiscriminate attack impacting thousands of companies. That'll be a big challenge. Going to your third thing about the utilities and the grid, you know, there's other folks that are probably better at answering this, but based on my experience, I think it's a long and hard decision to shut down the grid because that will cause lives to be lost. Period. You know, it'll be a food issue, it'll be a healthcare issue, and I think it's a decision that if somebody makes as an offensive entity, as a decision to escalate war. And if there is a bright line, you know, shutting down a major utility is one. My experience with the major utilities, though, is they do have redundancy. I think it would be hard to shut down a U.S. utility that's made, you know, Southern Co, Con Ed, PG&E. Those are tough targets. One thing to break into them, whole different thing with different skill sets to try to gracefully shut them down. And I think if you try the blunt force trauma cyber attack against a major utility, it just won't work. You'll delete a bunch of machines, but we're all still getting our energy. So I think it will be an attack where you need insiders to help you, at least knowledge-wise, or you got to read the manual if you break in. You got to figure out, how would I shut this utility down? But they all have fault tolerance, they all have separation, they're all regulated. And I feel confident that, in my opinion, the major utilities would stay up and running. So then it gets to the utilities in the smaller areas, the municipalities. Those are the ones that may not have the redundancy. But again, there is a deterrence. I still believe there's an unwritten deterrence to not shut down a utility in cyber. That's the last target you'll pick. And at that point, I just feel like there's already kinetic combat.
Kevin, Patrick Gall, Patrick is of course with NTSC. He says the cyber incident reporting legislation that's included in the omnibus funding package is going to take some time for CISA to actually enact. Does the Ukrainian situation create the motivation for the private sector to start sharing incident information now without the legislation? And if so, what's the mechanism for allowing them to do so?
Yeah, it's been my experience, and I come at this, there's a lot of folks out there that think nobody shares. It's been my experience, and we respond to over 1,000 breaches a year. Everyone actually does want to share. And what they're trying to figure out, and the real challenge is, there's almost 2 thresholds to sharing. What we have to loosen and allow to happen is the sharing of the intelligence that allows all of us to do a collective defense without all the other disclosure requirements that complicate disclosure for the private sector. And I'll give you an example. A lot of times within 3 days of us responding to a breach, we have the intel to attribute who it is and how to stop it. That needs to be shared immediately. But what we don't have is, what is the impact of the breach to customers, employees of that organization? And there's sometimes a pretty big lag. And we even had it at FireEye when we were compromised by Russian foreign intelligence in 2020. It took us an external firm going through some of the things that were taken so we can notify all the customers. It takes time to figure out, what did we lose? What's our disclosure requirements? I hate that lag, but it is real. It always exists when there's a breach of impact. If it's a destructive breach, the problem is almost every destructive breach right before it has a data pilfering. It's what's stolen and how to get your arms around that. That's the laggard. So I would tell you, the disclosure laws need to allow for intel to come right away, but the damage assessment takes some time. And that's always more complex for each organization. So I just always have urged our legislators to make sure we get the intel so we can protect the nation as fast as possible, and give extra time for an organization to figure out and who was impacted. But I've never seen a company drag, if they've hired us, they're not dragging their feet to share data and help. That's been my experience. And I do believe that every company, just the general sentiment, with or without the legislation, is to disclose and do community defense.
Kevin, Ricky George says, thanks, this is a great conversation. In the financial sector where I sit, we're well versed in cyber incident response testing, but there's always room to enhance our preparedness activities. What unique elements from the current conflict do you recommend organizations infuse into their cyber exercises and wargaming? Sector-wide exercises, cross-sector initiatives? That's a great question too.
It really is. Yeah, in the financial services, the one thing that's always been the hard thing for the banks is they're great at cybersecurity because they have to be, because the American public wants to have confidence in our financial system. So if there's one thing Russia would love to do, it's to lessen that confidence. And that could be with an influence operation, false advertising, deep fakes, fake news, whatever you want to call it. But it'll also have a cyber component to it. I think the best thing the banks can do, and they do it, is, again, get unvarnished truth with red teaming. Figure out, how do you withstand the newest and most novel attacks? Do you stop them, yes or no? If you don't stop them, do you detect them? And I would start with insider access. I'd grant a red team from any vendor and just say, you've got an account. What can you do from that account access on the inside? Can you escalate to network admin? Can you proliferate? And a bank's defenses need to be that even if one machine's compromised, your win is it never goes beyond the one. And that's really hard to build. It may be chasing perfection. There's a lot of ways to answer that question. Go to zero trust, block all lateral movement. There's so many ways to answer it, but ultimately I believe in red team versus blue team. And it doesn't even need to be adversarial. Call it purple teaming. I don't care what you call it. Shoot real bullets at your network and see how fast, simulate how broad could a ransomware attack or destructive attack work if somebody had internal access. And then how fast can you recover from that? So it comes down to, what are our critical assets? Are they backed up? Are the backups secure? And every bank has done those three things. The fourth thing that I'm not convinced every bank's done just yet, because it's actually hard, is how fast can you recover those key assets from your backups? And that's something that takes a lot of work. But we got to know what's our uptime when we need to come back, and that's all I think you could do. Test, run real drills.
Yeah, and you said last year, Kevin, before all the craziness of the world, it was the year of ransomware, and I think it was Dmitry Alperovich who said that a lot of these companies, because of the time it takes to recover their systems, just pay the ransom. Do you see any changes in that trend?
No one wants to pay. Start with that. Not one person wants to pay, and a lot of people recognize we have like 7 criteria on a slide that we show our customers and let them decide whether they want to pay or not. And sometimes payment occurs to protect customers. And different industries may have different regulations on how they need to handle it. The SEC does need to approve these things, but I've never met a company that just wakes up, hey, let's pay this. And I haven't even heard the conversation, well, insurance covers it, so let's pay it. I've never heard it. I am talking to the CEOs, and in general, they don't want to pay. That's the starting operating principle. If they get the payment, the only things I've observed is it's going to save lives or it's going to save a customer. I mean, that's really when you might see payment. It's because I think most CEOs actually will absorb pain outside of those things. Say, you know what, we're going to be down for a month, then we're not going to do it. So I think that's a long-winded answer of saying the trend to pay is going down. That being said, the pain caused by the attackers doing this is going up.
Yeah, that's not great news. Len Kennedy says you've urged some great steps here that should be taken. Doesn't this Russian threat show us that mandatory, not voluntary steps are required? Len Kennedy is an ex-telecom senior executive and former FCC official.
That's a great question. I've always felt, and I could be wrong, it's real hard, at least in the state we're all at in cyber right now, with the shortage of cybersecurity expertise, to legislate or mandate a baseline for security. Because, a restaurant doesn't need the same Fort Knox security. And we all recognize the cost of security is real, and all our startups, there's always that fear you will slow innovation if you have a 30-person startup and 12 of the 30 people are their security operations center. It is something that I don't think you can legislate the bar across all industry on how good cybersecurity should be or could be. And that's why you have regulated industries. That's why you have industry consortiums like the payment card industry for retailing seem to work really well. So what really is the hardest thing for us to answer as a nation is how do we help secure the smalls that are our supply chain, or the municipalities or the small government entities that just don't have the resources to defend themselves. And I think that's going to be an ongoing problem for us. And the problem is, if the supply chain is compromised, ultimately, does that mean that our bigs are compromised? And it may. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I think it's very hard. First off, you can mandate it right now. Hey, you all have to have multi-factor authentication for every account, whether internal or external, and you all have to go to zero trust. You mandate that right now. And most companies won't be there for the next 5 years. So even if we mandate it, there's going to be an enormous tail, and some companies may never get there. And zero trust, what it is quite frankly an interpretation, and there's a lot of different ways to skin it. But ultimately, that's where you need to go to, that zero trust. In, the data that people need is only, that data is only accessible to those folks, like financial data for the financial folks, HR data for the HR folks. The apps that need to talk to each other only talk to each other. Our accounts only allow us to access the resources we need. We constantly have to re-authenticate into every resource that we want to tap. Authentication has to be constantly reaffirmed and genuine, like you can't impersonate. So we've got a lot of different things to do zero trust. There may come a day where it's mandated. We couldn't get there as a nation across all industry and all markets and sizes for a decade.
Mm-hmm. Robert Orr says, is it possible that you're not seeing new and novel TTPs specifically because they are new and novel? For example, you can't see what you don't know yet. And SolarWinds would have been a great example of this question if I had known to ask you before.
Well, whoever asked that question, I believe the new and novel, there's always something that's not yet discovered that's out there. That's my belief. The way we find new and novel is not the way you want to. We found it because it's been used. So yes, right now as we are all on this call, my gut is something new and novel, certainly in use and undetected at this juncture. And there might be a little wisps of smoke, but we haven't identified it yet. It is incredulous to me to think it's not already out there.
Mm-hmm.
It's happening.
Okay, I know that we can't have you all day today. So before I come to you for some closing thoughts, I just want to talk quickly about something you mentioned earlier, which is we now are seeing more breaches than ever. How the government collects data is different than how the private sector collects data. I want to hit you up again one more time on sort of this like look over the horizon for me. With a new emergence of technology, with so much information now sitting in the hands of the private sector, how do you see this changing over the next few years, Kevin?
It is starting to change. Some of the consortiums between the industry and CISA work really well, and there's constant meetings, weekly, if not daily meetings under duress. There's open channels. I think we're just going to get a battle rhythm. I think here's what's the most important thing when it comes to intel. In my opinion, it's if you can be omniscient and know about an attack before it happens, that's the win, period. And that's hard to do, but it's actually possible. The government can see infrastructure popping up from different groups a lot of times, maybe before the private sector can, and they can feed some TTPs or things to look out for, and we can ruin the efficacy of infrastructure before it's ever put to use. That's a good thing. So that's just one example. But I think the private sector also has to figure out its rules of engagement and what data it can use when you look at the big platform companies. So we're always going to be threading the needle between the cultural issues and privacy that the platform companies have to employ and the value of that data to Intel. And I think we'll just always get better. One of the things we will get good at over time is recognizing new and novel and being able to just spit out, here's the indicators for the attack that's happening right now in a way where maybe there's only one or two victims to those new and novel attacks. You can go to Log4j, Suzanne. I've never seen our nation handle anything better than that in regards to timeliness. It just was like every single security vendor was coming up with real steps to defend every one of their customers right away. It was all same day. From the moment people knew about the vulnerability to the moment there's a ton of steps being communicated and implemented, worked really well. And I've lived this, enough times where you're responding to something that's new and novel. That's the Intel apparatus. Stop it if you can. If you can't stop it and something hits, the ability to get the AT&Ts and Verizons, the firewall companies, Palo Alto, Fortinet, Cisco, all of them, the desktop companies, get them all to do the shields up. All of us play a part there. That mechanism's going to get better and better. So we'll have same day, not just detections, but same day prevention across many vendors on new and novel attacks.
Mhm. Kevin, just in light of the sort of increased warnings, I think everybody was kind of waiting with bated breath after this Ukraine invasion happened, because they expected some sort of cyber attacks to happen much sooner than they did. And now you're seeing warnings. So as you mentioned right off the top, the government's seeing something that's indicating that there's a reason to issue higher warnings. What are you looking for, and how are you going to be preparing at Mandia besides hiring more people to answer the phones?
Well, it's so hard. There's so many things you do there. It's almost impossible to answer that. But you're going to have around the clock manning, 24/7 security operations. You're going to make more time to review things that you might not have ordinarily reviewed. So when you're going through that deselection, or minimization process from all your security telemetry down to here's what you think matters. We have automated ways that go through our security telemetry, and we have humans that do it. We have written correlation rules, and we have machine learning models. I just think you widen the aperture of what you throw a human at, and you look for odd things. We red team our networks all the time, and that helps us prioritize what we need to do next. But the steps, Suzanne, are too many to list. It's a 44-page document. But it's the biggest thing is this: have your people, and especially if you're small, make sure your folks are talking to somebody else, because I still think it's going to be like a brush fire. It's going to spread fast. The minute any vendor, whether it's Pan, Cisco, us, CrowdStrike, Microsoft, the minute any of us see something that is an escalation, I think everyone's going to know it, because it's just going to come out. We're not seeing anything in the United States above and beyond the normal threat activity we see from Russia. So in my opinion, they've intentionally shown constraint. But because of that, the minute they operationalize something above normal, I think we are all sensitized to it, and we will see it, and it will be communicated broadly.
Yeah. Kevin, what didn't I ask you that you were dying to tell us today?
Well, yeah, I think we asked all the right questions.
Yeah, excellent. Well, hey, I really want to thank you for taking the time to share your insights with us. I think everybody always loves hearing from you. You challenge people to think on their own, and that's part of what breaks this community so much stronger. So thanks for your time, your energy on this, and we'll be back in touch, I'm sure, as we look to welcome you for our Cyber Initiatives group session in May, but we'll talk before then. Kevin, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to thank everyone else as well. For our Subscriber Plus members, thanks so much for your support. It makes all the difference. Thanks again to Mandiant for their support of this session today. And Brad and I are going to be back here with you tomorrow, not here, but with our Open Source Report podcast. I hope you subscribe to that. It's a really quick 10 to 12 minute digestion of what's going on around the world that you're not hearing about in your normal news feed that's impacting national security. And we just added a cyber and tech division to that. So look it up. You can subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks very much. We'll be back here with you again soon. Take care.